Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you can see and hear us clearly enough. For those who don't know, my name is Sean Slade. I'm one of the two co-heads of education here in the US of BTS Spark. And as you can tell also from the accent, I'm not originally from the US, but originally from Australia. But we have a great lineup today to discuss a fairly pertinent topic, at least pertinent here in the US, and I believe, at least by the number of people who have signed up from Australia, also very pertinent in Australia as well. Just going through the registrations, I've said this a couple of times on these webinars, but we could probably have another 1 or 2 or 3 panels just from the people who have signed up as to attend this webinar as well. I know that Parsi Solberg from University of New South Wales signed up. I saw Jenny Lewis's name from Forever Learn and Wise. We've had educators from the National Institute of Education in Singapore, the Queen Rania Teacher Academy in Jordan, the Inspirasi Foundation in Indonesia. It's been quite amazing, the number of people signing up for these webinars. We also had questions about the recording. They all get recorded and uploaded to our YouTube page, and you all get notified once they are up and running as well. The way that we organize these, we are on Zoom, as you can tell. I'm sure by now, after 18 months, you're all master's degree experts at using Zoom and organizing it. But if you're not, I know that they've done a couple of new little variations. So if you click onto that top tab where it says view options and click on side by side, you as the participant can actually make the screen with the PowerPoints as big or as small as you wish. And if you click onto the gallery view, you're able to also see all of the speakers as we engage in what should be a fun conversation as well. So you are in charge of the way that you view the screens. Obviously, and I can see it happening already, there is a chat box going on with people chiming in from where they are around the world. British Columbia's come up, Melbourne's coming up, obviously, and a couple of others. I actually saw a couple of people from Adelaide as well, which is my hometown. So welcome to everybody from South Australia as well. We will be having questions and answers from the audience, and I'll remind you during this webinar as well. But if you can put in your Q&As anytime you want, and then we'll spend 5 or 10 minutes towards the end just going through and relaying your questions back to the panelists. Now, before we introduce the panelists, I want to set the scene so we know what we're talking about here. And we do try and make these to be conversations as opposed to a down the line discussion. But we raised the title of this webinar to be Instructional versus Transformational Leadership, with a question mark purposefully at the end, because we want to debate whether it should be one or the other, or whether it should be both, or whether it should be something different. And the reason this conversation has come up, as with many of our conversations, is because of the pandemic that we are currently in, though many of us are actually at least seeing the light at the end of the tunnel as the vaccines start to roll out around our countries. But as we say, and this was an article that myself and Alyssa Gallagher put out this month in Ed Week, and it's obvious that schools are going to need leaders who are effective in leadership and in instruction and pedagogy. But what we're finding is that that's really only half the story, that there's also this need to engage teams and bring them on, bring them along with a common vision or common values. And when we look back, especially here in North America, where I'm based, we look back at what's happened over the last 18 months through COVID, and a lot of the schools and a lot of the districts that have actually coped best during this tumultuous, uncertain time, some might say VUCA time, are the ones that have had a distributive leadership, where they've been able to make decisions on the fly, where they've been able to bring people in and really engage them around a common vision, or make decisions themselves without having to wait from an organization or a system above them to make those decisions. So it seems like, at least from our perspective, that the schools and the districts that have this capacity have actually done the best over the last 12 or 18 months. This was a quote that we had in the article as well from Michael Fullen. Michael was actually a guest on one of our panels a couple of months ago. But this was a quote that came from a piece that he wrote a number of years ago, but he replaced it into and reiterated it into a recent publication that he put out, talking about how a new kind of leadership is necessary to really break this status quo. And so in this discussion today, we want to really try and pass apart this discussion about what kind of leadership are we needing, and is it different than really what we've had before. Now, there is a bit of an elephant in the room that we also need to discuss. You know, almost everybody on this call, I believe, would be familiar with John Hattie's work. But there was that study that John Hattie did, and his colleagues did, which looked at the impact of transformational leadership as compared to instructional leadership. And if you take the 0.40 being the equivalent of 1 year's growth in student outcomes for 1 year, 1 year's learning, you can see that instructional leadership is doing better than transformational leadership. But at the same time, when you look at what John Hattie says about this, he really starts to talk about who the object of that leadership is. So are we talking only about student outcomes or student learning, or in transformational, are we talking about something slightly different? And again, we brought these people together today because of their experience, their knowledge, their expertise around this topic, and I think it's going to be a really engaging conversation. So what the topic really becomes, if we want to plan it out or stretch it out a little bit more, is instructional versus transformational leadership. Is it one or the other, or is it both, or is it something different?
Okay, great.
Now, to help us answer these questions, and there are some people, if any of the panelists does have some background noise, just mute your line for a moment, that would be great. For some reason, I'm not sure why, but we have a Taylor Irish. I think if you could mute your line, that would be fantastic. Let me introduce the panelists that we do have on. So Robyn Jackson probably doesn't need much introduction to most of the people here on this webinar, but she's been the author of many books from ASCD and other organizations. Robyn was actually a guest of ours when we did a whole child symposium a couple of years ago on teacher leadership, and probably best known, at least in the past, for books like Never Underestimate Your Teachers, Never Work Harder Than Your Students. But Robyn has been doing some amazing work around what she's been calling buildership. So we want to hear from Robyn. So Robyn, if you can turn your camera on, that would be fantastic. And we'll give a quick hello and a wave to the audience as well.
Hello.
There we are, fantastic. And even though it's confusing, Robyn and I are actually in the same geographical area, probably only about 3 or 4 miles apart, looking out at darkness at the moment, but if it wasn't dark, it would be a lovely autumn day with the leaves changing colour.
Yes.
We also have Bruce Armstrong, who's not experiencing autumn at the moment, but in Melbourne. And Bruce, as many of you know, because we do have lots of people from Victoria who have tuned into this, was the inaugural director of the Bastow Institute of Educational Leadership in Victoria, and now serves as the special advisor for teaching and learning with the Victorian Department of Education and Training. So Not good evening, but good morning to you, Bruce.
Good morning and welcome everyone. What a wonderful opportunity to explore this really important topic together.
And we also have our very own Rosie Connor, who, don't let the accent fool you, which is English, but she's based in Sydney and has been for a long time. Rosie leads BTS Spark's education, leadership development and coaching work globally and was instrumental. We will be showing some of our mindset hexagons during this, and Rosie was instrumental in bringing those across into BTS Spark and utilizing them as a really key framework. So welcome to you as well, Rosie.
Thanks, Sean. Hi, everybody.
And last but not least, back in North America, we have Amy Newman. Amy is the principal of Cloverdale Traditional School in Surrey in British Columbia. And I imagine you'll also be experiencing some nice fall weather and changing of the leaves up there, Amy.
Yes, that's for sure. A little bit wet at the moment.
Exactly. And Amy's been working with BTS Spark and also with the Surrey schools and some leadership development that's been going on there. So it's great to get the practitioner focus as well. All right, we're going to launch into it, but before we open it up to these general discussions that we are aiming to do, we're going to give everybody a minute to actually have the floor to themselves. Not a long time, but what we're going to ask people to do is actually just respond to what this phrase means to you. Instructional versus transformational leadership, or what does instructional mean? What does versus mean? What does transformational mean? And first up, I'm going to ask Robyn to take the floor.
When I first read these phrases, I was not sure what the difference was, what the distinction was, because I feel like instructional leadership has to be a part of transformational leadership, or it's not truly transformational. When I looked at Hattie's distinction, he was looking at transformational leadership through the lens of that traditional business school definition of transformational leadership, where you were talking about, kind of focusing on the teachers rather than on student outcomes. And even that distinction was a little blurry for me, because I don't know how you really move a school forward without doing some of both. And so I'm really interested to have the discussion tonight, because I think that transformational leadership and instructional leadership may be, at least for me, a bit of a false dichotomy.
Wonderful. Thank you, Robyn. Next up, we're going to hand over to you, Bruce. 1 minute.
Thank you. Thank you, Robyn. And I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm coming to you from in Melbourne, Australia. I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And look, when I saw this too, I was in that same place of here's a false dichotomy. What I know Hattie's research, and I do think that it uses some kind of old categories. Instructional language is often new. What do we mean by pedagogical leadership? How do you bring the curriculum, the pedagogy and assessment together in a way that provides high quality teaching to all learners, as diverse as they are? And transformational leadership. So it's kind of what's sitting in these categories for me. What are the capabilities, the knowledge, skills and dispositions that sit in these categories that create organisations that are hospitable to human learning, both for the adults and the children that are in them? And how do we think of that broad set of outcomes that we're looking for to enable learners to thrive for today and tomorrow? So I'm looking forward to how we unpack these terms. The binary worries me.
Wonderful. Yeah, I love some of the phrases you were using there as well. I've loved what both of you have said before, but I love the human learning, the thriving. We see these words coming out time and time again. Rosie?
So I'd agree that what we want to look at is a both and strategy, maybe a shared instructional leadership or collaborative instructional leadership approach, which prioritises student outcomes, absolutely, but looks at empowering teachers to achieve those student outcomes. We believe that leadership is completely contextual. Every school context is so different. So it would be really naive to look at this as like a one-size-fits-all best school leadership approach. I actually think what principals and assistant principals certainly come to us for is in supporting the implementation. It's about the how-to. It's about what's relational skills, people leadership skills do I need to get the best out of my team? And how do I shift mindsets, my own mindsets and other people's mindsets in order to shift practice?
Wonderful. And Amy, we're going to give you the last minute before we launch into one of the big all-in questions.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you to the panel. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. It's hard to be fourth because, my gosh, you've all said such wonderful things, which is exactly what I was thinking. I'm coming to you. I'd like to start by just acknowledging that I'm coming to you today from the unceded territories of the Katzie, Kwantlen, and Semi-Amu First Nations in beautiful Surrey, British Columbia, Canada. As Bruce said, versus cannot be thought of as a binary here, but more of a both and, which Rosie already mentioned. I mean, Hattie himself called it a simplistic contrast. So I was really troubled by the binary. And so I think I wanted to champion the transformational piece a bit. And I did so by looking at the etymology of transformational, which means to change shape or character, metamorphose, to move across and beyond. So you can hear in that language that transformational leadership really implies significant, deep change over time. Transformation requires collaboration, courage, and an ongoing willingness to remain open and curious. So as several of you already said, true transformation clearly embraces all members of our school community. It's not working just with student population or teacher population. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, as you can see already, this is going to be a fascinating conversation. We could have probably expanded that first question into a general question and tackled that for 10 or 15 minutes. I think it's going to be really compelling. We are going to launch into the first question now. And yes, the statement putting it up there, instructional versus, was intentionally provocative, exactly for many of the reasons that you were putting out there. But at the same time, at least here in the US, we have found some schools that maybe have been fixated on instruction only, who have actually not thrived during the past 18 months, who have actually reverted back to older ways of doing things, more traditional ways of doing things, or tried to abdicate responsibility in really making change or adjusting to the changing environments that are out there. So what we want to ask now, and there are 3 questions, and you can tackle any one of these that you want, they're all linked, but really, why is this discussion pertinent now in 2021, 2022? And the second part is, has it always been a key need for schools, even prior to the pandemic? And the last one is really looking at, is it becoming more needed than previous times? And by that, I'm referring back to some of the work that I've read from Valerie Hannon, David Howes, Seeing and Believing, The Future School is Here, or Tony McKay, and again, Valerie Hannon's work recently on the future of educational leadership and the 5 signposts, where they're talking a lot of the time about the need for transformation inside schools and for schools to actually be empowered to make that transformation. So I'm going to leave that there and just open the floor to anybody that wants to take first dibs at this.
You know, when I look at this question, I think about a quote that's attributed to Warren Buffett, who said that when the tide goes out, you realize who's been swimming naked. And when it comes to why we need to have this conversation right now, the tide came out during COVID. The pandemic is the equivalent of the tide going out. And many of us found that the things that we were doing, that we were calling leadership, that we thought were moving our schools forward, were not working in a new environment. And so the discussion is relevant now because we're finding that a lot of things that we relied on, whether it's our teachers who relied on a particular strategy for moving students, or whether it's administrators who relied on, the status quo for how they move their schools forward, those things no longer worked. We realized a lot of us were swimming naked. And there's this opportunity now to really question what we've always taught or thought we've known about leadership and how it works, because what the pandemic has revealed to us is that a lot of the things that we thought were what was keeping our school going, those things were not actually doing that. And so now we're scrambling to try to figure out what new things can we put in place for this moment that will help make us impervious to future crises. And I don't know that as a profession, we've really had that conversation or come up with answers around that yet.
I mean, I really can't top that quote, Robyn. Struggling to follow on from you. But I mean, clearly we've always known that school leadership is important. A lot of researchers quote it as the second biggest factor in school improvement after the quality of teaching. But what the pandemic's highlighted is what kind of leadership really works in all different circumstances, and particularly in uncertain times. And the research that BTS Spark did showed that superhero leaders, superhero principals were really struggling through the pandemic, because what they were doing before, which was trying to protect and buffer their staff, have all the answers, it just wasn't working. What you needed to be is much more flexible, much more agile, much more distributed in your leadership approach, and empowering of others. And for me, like the big word here was also around collective efficacy. I mean, never before has collective efficacy been so important as when schools became locked down and had to go online. The one thing that carried those schools and those school systems forward was a collective belief amongst teachers, every teacher in your school, that they could continue to impact on student outcomes, both individually and collectively. But they had to pivot massively. Clearly, schools had to become student-centered as never before, looking at the whole child, their environment of support at home, their skills as an independent learner. So it's been really interesting times. And a massive shout out to all of you in schools who have managed your schools through those difficult times. Where that a lot of people here from Melbourne, Victoria, most lockdown city in the world, and many of you others. So congratulations. It's been tough.
I wonder if I can jump in and say, wow, absolutely, Rosie. I guess we're tired of hearing the word unprecedented, but there's just nothing like what we've dealt with. It really is new and different, and there isn't a roadmap for sure. I feel like the ability to respond and adapt, as you said, is really important, and that we have to bring in these significant worldly issues like, the climate emergency, issues of equity, issues of access. Like, these issues have come to the fore, and they're critical not only for the health and well-being of our planet, but also the daily lives of our students and staff, many of whom I think carry mounting fear and anxiety around their future. What will my future be? Do I have a future? So I think leadership now really needs to be engaging staff, students, and communities by being relevant, inclusive, and by offering hope. I think hope matters, and I think hope's a critical piece of our work moving forward in schools. We want to be more responsive, we want to be equitable and more humane, and I think we do that through connection, through really deep connection, learning every child's name, mentoring and championing every staff member, and opening our hearts to our communities.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. I think that thread about those big, bold, ambitious goals of education, this question of instructional versus transformational, at its heart opens the question about the purposes of education. And there are many purposes of education. And I think that we've been pushed by systems into the more utilitarian ones, through standardized testing, through narrow metrics of outcomes for students, which often chafe against what teachers want to build into their classrooms and their learning communities. And we've seen, you know, this yawning chasm between the equity gaps that have been opened up, even in this wonderful responsiveness of the educational community, educational leaders and teachers and their support staff in pivoting to online learning, opened up the possibilities, but also exposed the cracks and the fissures in our education systems, where kids were being left behind from, challenged communities and the socioeconomic divide, and particularly globally, where there wasn't the opportunity to be able to go online. So I think stepping into that is there's, vision of what education is for, those kind of big purposes around equity, inclusion, the civic compact of education, so I think that, that education doesn't serve a public, it creates one. In that Postman quote, how are we creating this public that we want? What sort of societies do we want to create? How are they inclusive and responsive and socially just, I think are really important. And I think that goes to the heartland of that issue around instruction, instruction for what? Transformation for whom?
Mm-hmm. One of the challenges that I often have with, even that conversation about I'm looking at the third question, is it becoming needed more than in previous times? And, my answer to that would be absolutely not. We've always needed something, and we have been operating at this level where we've been kind of making it, and we haven't really moved the needle much. And so, just even Bruce, you were talking about how there are all these big questions that are sitting out there, but how often, when it gets down to not people like us, like on a panel, but what the districts, the people who are making decisions, are they making decisions through the lens of those questions? Are they asking, who is my district here to serve? Everybody wants transformational leadership. They have conferences about it. People write books about it, but transform from what to what and for what purpose? And those are the questions I think go unasked whenever we're trying to think about topics like this. We have these conversations here, but I don't know that they're being had at the places where they create policies that impact the day-to-day lives of teachers and principals.
Let me take that question then and roll on that one, Robyn, because I agree with you 100%. It's like, and I agree with what you were saying as well, Bruce, about this has now forced us or allowed many of us to have these deeper questions about what is the purpose of education and what is it serving and who is it serving. Has this pandemic actually allowed and forced us to have these conversations more in education? And then a follow-up question is, what kind of leadership are we going to need in our schools? So, Robyn, as you were saying, they're not having these conversations. What kind of leadership are we going to need in these schools so that every stakeholder can have these conversations?
So I'll say another phrase that we often say, at least at our campus, is we say the fish rots from the head. And it's the idea that the conversations, what trickles down into the school building is a version of the conversations that people are told are important from the district leader, from the state leaders, and that sort of thing. So I think that the conversations, ideally would start at that level, and that, I would love to see superintendents not just coming together and talking to each other, but including, inviting people in to have the conversations with them, to look at their school districts objectively, to challenge them, to bring those experts in, to seek out that, not just read a study, random study from Hattie, or worse, cliff notes of a Hattie study where they just take the big takeaways and are like, that's it, Hattie said it, we're going to make it a policy. But actually sitting down and bringing people in, bringing not just experts in, bringing classroom teachers in who have a wealth of knowledge that goes untapped, bringing in, building assistant principals, not just principals, because assistant principals see something different, bringing in kids, having focus groups with everybody and rounding out that picture of what education is supposed to be doing and why they're there. I think it go a long way towards, making better policy, which actually then drives that conversation or keeps that conversation going.
Yeah, I think it's interesting for me to reflect on your questions, Sean, in that it's interesting that the pandemic, you know, a crisis once in 100 years that's kind of had this ongoing global impact, highlighted two things. That we've invested billions of dollars into educational technology and information and communication technologies to little effect really on the educational experience of young people, and we haven't been able to exploit their potential really for the kind of flexibility and different modes of learning in different group sizes and different strategies for engaging young people who are immersed in technologies as digital natives. But it also showed the opportunity and the capacity of teachers to take what they probably weren't leveraging to its maximum effect before. This was forced upon them with remote teaching, particularly in Victoria, as we've experienced with the longest period of lockdown in the world. And yet it also showed how important learning communities are for socialization, for human connection, the kind of humanness of the enterprise that we're engaged in, that it really is uniquely about content, but in the presence of these sets of really important relationships, which I think brings to me the instructional and transformational set. You have a set of purposes around the quality of teaching and engagement, but it's a uniquely and importantly human enterprise. It's the connection of people, and it's those relationships and how important they are. And the type of leaders we need are people who can do both of those things. You know, we have these throwaway words around agility and nimbleness and resilience, but they are kind of the transformational set that Vivian Robinson talks about in her most recent work around courage and perseverance and open-mindedness and empathy, or the personal resources that Ken Leithwood, as Emeritus Professor in his revisited 7 Strong Claims of Leadership, said there's a whole lot of cognitive and social and emotional resources that you need to be able to engage and motivate your staff. So you need both of those things in a crisis. You know, the leader needs to be able to build the morale of their faculty and staff, and they need to be really focused on what are the outcomes that we're seeking as we teach our kids. So I think, you know, it comes back to that. We need both of these.
I can't, Bruce.
Go ahead, Rosie. I'm going to move it on, but go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Bruce, I can't agree more. I think the pandemic has just reminded us that, look, education is essentially, it's a people business, right? And if we lose sight of the critical people leadership skills in all of this, we do so at our peril. You know, when we're coaching school leaders, we find that half of all of our conversations and our programs are focusing on relational skills, because it's those people issues that trip everyone up, even outside of the pandemic.
Yeah, wonderful. And you've set it up perfectly for the next slide as well. So in a way, you've already answered this question, all of you, because I'm imagining it's a combination. It's a soup of all of these things where you need to be a pedagogical expert, you need to understand instruction, but you're needing more and more to actually understand the people, the human side of leadership, and allow people to make decisions when they enter these times of uncertainty as well. Amy, let me turn to you and just get your perspective on this, and maybe you can also just relate back to us about how Surrey coped with a pandemic or is coping with a pandemic from the last 18 months.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so eager to jump in. It's such an interesting conversation. It's been extremely challenging, and like Bruce said, we're hearing about nimbleness and agility, and we pivoted again, and now we pivot again. And there's some truth in that. Moving on a dime into closing schools for all intents and purposes, not technically closing, but having communities learning online. Teachers really had to adapt quickly, and it's fascinating because some of them loved that work. They felt closer than ever to their students. There's an intimacy to being online, you know, and they just enjoyed that, and they felt like there was no classroom management really in the same way. Well, there was, but not in the same way, right? And yet, while there was some really, I think, powerful learning skills and experiences with my staff who were working online, there was also an aching need to be with human beings, as we've surfaced already, right? Education is human beings. As a school leader, how was I to connect with my staff when they're physically not here? And that was its own challenge. But I have to say on a positive note that, you know, making phone calls, connecting to that on Zoom, on Teams, videoing, and there was an intimacy there, and a real one-to-one that I had with my staff that I felt was really, really powerful. Whether it's support staff, I was on phone calls with staff and talking to kids online every single day. So I think there's some really positive stuff. And in terms of Surrey, just very quickly, we had a hybrid model called blended. So they were sort of partially at home and partially in the building. And then we had a fully at home. And then we had some our emergency service workers that had their kids in school full time. So we had several models to choose from. And I think we did a really a good as job as could happen when we had to shift and contemplate that level of complexity.
Yeah, maybe what you were introducing there could actually be a topic for another webinar as well. I just think when you were describing about, you know, the new settings and being online and having to find new ways to interact and connect and form relationships with your students and your colleagues as well, that maybe also allowed a lot of the educators and leaders to actually form a different mindset and have a more open-minded perspective about what can be an effective education. Like sometimes we see it as being, you know, a very narrowing format, but maybe actually the fact that we were forced into it allowed us to take a new perspective on education.
Exactly.
Yeah. So anybody else? You know, I think we've sort of tinkered around on this question, but anything else you want to discuss around this relationship between instructional, transformational, collaborative, distributive leadership and how and where they fit together?
Yeah, I think you know, what sits in the circles is really important, you know, because if you take the instructional set, you know, what's sitting in there in the, you know, if you look at that work of Hattie's, what's actually sitting in there? And I think Robyn mentioned this before, you know, you've got to unpack it a little bit. You know, some of that instructional work was very narrow. It was about the supervision and assessment of teacher work. It would be coming and sitting and watching a class for 20 minutes and then making an assessment about, you know, a teacher's effectiveness, for example, or doing walkthroughs that are a bit more like a drive-through at a takeaway outlet, you know, that are not really engaging the staff in the work. But if you're thinking about instructional as being, you know, this rich nature of what is supporting a teacher and a group of teachers and the support and allied staff that are creating a quality program and how they engaged in that. You know, one of the key drivers of instructional improvement in the Robinson research is the principal and leadership team, the head teachers and so on, learning with their staff. So it's really important to understand, well, where you do want the leader to be a learner, you know, and you want them to be learning with others. And you want, you know, you don't want rapid and chaotic change, but you want thoughtful and deep improvement. You know, Vivian Robinson talks about leaders using their professional knowledge and research to work on complex problems of practice while building relational trust. So you don't just do the transformational thing, which is building trust with people without advancing the work of school improvement. So you could do the transformational thing and not actually change the core of schooling. Or you could try and work on the core of schooling, but not have the kind of emotional intelligence that allows you to work well in building relational trust that will allow you to create the organisational conditions to advance the core of the work. And then depending on how large your school is, your learning community, well, you want to engage other people in that. The students want to be part of that collaborative set as activating student voice and connecting as parents as first educators of their children. So I think for me, what's in the circles is as important as whether they're joined up or not, you know, because you could be joining up the wrong things.
Exactly.
I'd like to.
Yeah, and it's also what definitions we're using as well around what we mean by instructional, what we mean by collaborative, what we mean by transformational. You've actually set us up very nicely as well, Bruce. Rosie, I want to turn it over to you in a minute, and then I want to come back to Robyn. But Rosie, I'd like you to maybe outline, he was talking about Vivian Robinson's work, and a lot of the work that we do at BTS Spark with the mindsets really do match and echo some of Vivian Robinson's work. So if you don't mind, I'm going to jump to a slide and see if you can talk us through a little bit of this as well.
So yeah, we thought this might be helpful to share, to, as Bruce said, actually unpack those circles. So nice and unintentional setup there, Bruce. And I know many people are familiar with the Vivian Robinson model around instructional leadership, student-centered leadership. So Vivian really proposes there being three critical leadership capabilities: the need to integrate knowledge, to get the data, to then just, if you leave a slide, Sean, to then move on to problem solving, and then to do that, all of that in a climate of building relational trust. But if we unpack each of those circles, so the first circle would be about integrating knowledge. What we see is a whole heap of mindsets, you can call them dispositions, which are really important, both to have that growth mindset. Bruce was saying that it's critical for school leaders to be learners, to be curious, to be open to learning and growing, but to also challenge the way things are done when they're integrating that knowledge, and searching diverse data sources while staying student-centric. So there's a number of mindsets that are critical behind that leadership capability around integrating knowledge. If we then move on to what Vivian Robinson talks about as complex problem solving, clearly there's a need to envision a different way of working, then try out new approaches on quite a fast cycle. So Simon Breakspear talks about the sprints here being important around disciplined experimentation, trying something new and then evaluating it on a fast cycle. But there's all these relational skills needed around empowering others to solve these problems and collaborate with you, stretching their horizons and what they think they may be capable of, potentially having difficult conversations around trying things differently, and challenging old ways of doing things. And then, of course, building relational trust. Well, how long have you got around how tricky that can be with certain members of your team? So that really calls in effective listening and questioning, ability to deepen trust, to build empathy and rapport, to flex your style for different people within your team, to be inclusive in your approach when you're engaging others, to give feedback so that people can build and develop and improve their practice. So trying to unpack some of those instructional leadership capabilities, but actually realizing that there's a whole heap of mindsets, many of which you'd call transformational leadership mindsets, that actually sit behind that instructional leadership model.
Wonderful. And we'll be sending out, we do follow up with an email when the recording goes up, but we'll be sending out some of this information, or I think in the chat box there could be some information linking this, so people can view it themselves. Robyn, though, let's just go back to this original slide, because I know that you've been, the latest work you've been doing is all around buildership. And I'm wondering if you could outline what you mean by buildership and maybe explain to everybody how and where it does, or perhaps even doesn't fit along this continuum.
So I was just sitting here thinking, I just finished reading a book called Effortless, and he talks about how, he tells a story in the book about how when the builders of PayPal were trying to work on the checkout process back in the early days of the internet. Do you remember when you bought something online, you'd have to go through a page where you had to put your name in, then you'd go through another screen, you put your email in, another one you put your address in, and it was cumbersome. And so they were trying to figure out how to make it easier. So the team spent months tweaking each of those pages in the checkout process. And they went back to the CEO and they showed him what they had done. And the CEO says, I want people to be able to click a button and it's done. And they had a watershed moment. They didn't realize that they were so busy tweaking the pieces of it that they didn't realize that maybe what we need to do is start from zero and do something better. And so the idea of buildership comes from that same idea that a lot of times when we are trying to fix leadership, we give it another name. So, it's transformational leadership today, and before it was servant leadership and collaborative leadership and shared leadership, which is a misnomer because a lot of times people think shared leadership means co-joined leadership, that everybody has to be involved in every decision, and that's not leadership at all. That's abdication of leadership and leaving it out to the vote. So we keep tweaking leadership when we actually need something bigger than what leadership can provide. Because as you can see, even in the conversations, is it instructional? Is that transformational? Is that really, we're tweaking the different pages of the checkout option rather than taking a step back and saying, as a profession, all right, maybe we need something else. Is there a one-click alternative? And so I've been playing around with this idea of buildership, which is different than leadership, because whereas, Mayor Haig said in, I think, 2009, he wrote an article, he's an economist for Harvard Business Review, and he talked about the difference between bosses, leaders, and builders. And one of the things that he said that stuck with me ever since is he said, bosses say go, and leaders say, let's go. We've probably heard that. But then he said something that changed everything for me. He said, builders say come. And so the idea of buildership is rather than dragging people towards a goal or convincing or cajoling people towards a goal, why don't we just step out and start building something better and invite people into that? And as we do that, as we reconsider everything and create and build something that's even bigger and better than what we could have imagined in the paradigm where we were, if we step away, we step ahead and start trying to build something new and then invite people to join us, I don't have to drag people, I don't have to cajole, I don't have to convince. And there's a natural collaboration, there's a natural sharing, because once you invite people to join you in building, they pick up a hammer, they say, hey, this will be better over here, or this will be better over there. And they begin to contribute to that bigger vision of what you're building. And so that's the idea of buildership that I'm playing around with and trying to figure out, what does that look like? And what does that look like specifically in a school context with real people, real students, real challenges every single day? And how can that make our schools crisis proof? Not that we don't experience a pandemic, but that when we do, it doesn't upend everything because we're builders. We take whatever material we have and we keep building. So that's what buildership is. And I think that challenges the notion that these are three separate pieces or that they're a continuum, or is it shared or collaborative, by just stepping away and saying, what if we started from zero? What if we didn't think about it? Because once we, our language confines us. So once we think leadership, we automatically bring on the baggage that leadership contains. If we step away from that word, if we start to reimagine what this thing looks like, if we give it another name, does that then open up possibilities for how we can explore what we're doing and make it better?
Fantastic. As always, we could probably go on with any of these questions and discuss them for 15, 20, 30 minutes each. I do want to move forward. We are about 12 minutes out from the end. If there are questions from the audience, now is the perfect time to put them in. One question that has come in already is, where can people, I'm going to skip over, we've a couple of these. As a good educator, I always have a couple of extra questions and extra slides just in case we had 30-second answers only. So we're going to move to the Q&A from the audience. But the first question is a very practical one, which is, where can people, we've talked about these services, about buildership, about the mindsets, about focusing on thriving, focusing on powering stakeholders. Where can people either find these services for leaders, or what are some of the first steps that people can do in order to change their mindset around this continuum or this mix of different leadership styles? And that's open to anybody.
So coming from a coaching organisation, clearly I would say, if you're trying to seriously change your mindset or help people in your school change your mindset, then actually investing in some personalized support, I just think is so critical. We know that leadership is contextual, that going to a one-size-fits-all leadership program is only going to take you so far. And we know the evidence that if you add on coaching to a training program, it's going to be 400% more effective, 4 times more effective. So it's about personalizing that learning. So if you haven't already accessed personal support for yourself or your team, I would definitely be considering that seriously as an option.
May I just jump in and say thanks for that, Rosie. The coaching experience for me was remarkable and important. And as Rosie says, and other people on the panel have also echoed, the context is so critical. And you know, there isn't a one-size-fits-all model that covers this leadership style, check that box, we got it, you know? It's so contextual, it's complex, it's nuanced, it's fluid, it's moving, we're human beings. So it's kind of moment by moment. I can just say in Surrey that we really focus on collective goals and shared leadership on these cycles of inquiry, and that I think the district really honors our context and doesn't expect that my school looks like Robyn's school, looks like Bruce's school, but instead supports us to be the best we can in our buildings, and really looking at our priority practices, quality assessment, instructional strategies, curriculum design, social emotional learning. These ideas are all nested right inside each other, rather than I don't see that so much as a continuum, but more that these ideas are nested in one another.
I would say question everything. I mean, you want to talk about something you can do right now. I know that many of you who are in the school context, you are dealing with so much. You're dealing with, you know, teachers being out and no subs available and a lack of drivers and, you know, quarantines. You're dealing with the social emotional impact of a global pandemic. And you're trying to help children learn, many of whom may not have been in a person-to-person school setting in almost 2 years. So you have now second graders who, you know, never learned some of the really important socialization that happened in kindergarten, first grade. So you're dealing with a lot right now. And so I don't want to add anything to your plate. What I would challenge you to do right now is to question whether it has to be done. So one of the questions I've been playing around with a lot is, what if it were easy? Like, this is the hard thing that I'm doing. What would it look like if it were easy? And I'm questioning everything, and I'm challenging other people to question, this is the way we've always done it. Well, you know what, we are in a place now, it's almost like a wild, wild west. We can reinvent. So this thing that we've always done, if it feels hard, why are we doing it? Is there an easier way? And so if you did nothing else, but just took a look at your day and started questioning what you were doing and started asking yourself, you know, that's one of the reasons why having a coach is really important, because the coach can see things you can't. You're in the weeds, you know, I don't know what to do. But if you start questioning things and saying, okay, yeah, I know I've always done this, but is this the most efficient way? Because, you know, that effect size, you know, we didn't talk about it a lot, but that effect size is still really small. Like, even 0.42 is the best we can get, and that's equivalent to maybe a year's worth of growth. Are you kidding me? Is that the best? The teachers, administrators are some of the most brilliant people I've ever known. Is that really the best that a collective group of brilliant people can do on behalf of children? So if at our best right now, instructional leadership, transformational leadership, we can get a year's worth of growth. If we do everything right, then let's start questioning things and saying, should we be doing this? Is this really serving our students? You know, that I think is the overlap between transformational leadership and instructional leadership. Because when you start doing that, when you work at the service of a vision that is really about what your kids can accomplish, and you start figuring out, okay, we've always said visions that say 52% of our kids will be reading at proficient or above. Are you kidding me? So you're going to work really hard to get half of your kids reading. Where is the vision that says 100% of our students are going to be reading at our above grade level? And then what would it take to get there? And if what we're doing isn't getting us there, we should question it, we should challenge it, and we should build something better.
Fantastic. Yeah, it reminds me. Sorry, go ahead, Bruce.
I was just going to say that I think that one of the things that I would encourage people to do that builds on what Robyn and Amy was saying, is community. Leaders need, a coach, but you need a community. The work that you put up at the beginning, Sean said that the people who seem to do better as leaders were the people who were well networked. And so I would say if you haven't got a community, create a community because it helps you find a safe place for conversation. I think that leadership is often about information and not about formation. And I think that coaching is about helping form you, about interrogating your mindsets, getting up above the weeds, as Robyn was saying. And I think that it's really important to have a community, both to help you with your resilience and with your growth in response to your context, but also to deal with some of the threads come up around the issues of power. And buildership is about the sharing of power. It's about power with people, not power over people. And I think that often in leadership, we don't talk about power. And I think it's really important to have a community that can help you look at how you are using power or misusing power, and how you can grow as a leader in the company of other people that it's trusted and safe. And the people that I see doing well are the people that have those trusted spaces, whether it's one-on-one or a smaller community or a network. And so I would encourage that.
Wonderful. We're going to, if we were looking for tweetable quotes to come out of this webinar, I think we've had a dozen already, from Warren Buffett and swimming naked in the tide coming into information, falsely thinking information, not formation. It's like we've had some really interesting thoughts and really interesting quotes. I couldn't agree more with everything that's been said in the last couple of minutes. This idea that we need to question what we're doing and question why we're doing it as well. Actually, because I don't think we ask ourselves enough even what the fundamental purpose, or like you were saying, Bruce, earlier on, purposes of education really is. We're going to run out of time, as we always seem to. For anybody who's on, and a couple of people have asked about the recording, it does get recorded, or it is getting recorded, and it will be posted to our YouTube site, and you will be emailed, as long as you registered, when that goes up. I'm going to turn now, because we're running out of time, to a 1-minute summary. If there's something that you would like to say to summarize what's been said, or any actions that people can take home with them, we're going to give each of our wonderful panelists 1 minute to go through that, and then I'll do some quick wrapping up as well. Amy, we're gonna start with you up north.
Up north. Okay, thank you, Sean. I will just say briefly that I recently heard Numan Ashraf from the Rotman School of Business in Toronto say, the behavior that we walk past is the culture that we enable, right? The behavior that we walk past is the culture that we enable. So action, this question is about action. Action could look like paying deep attention, listening, being purposeful, noticing what you walk past, right? And working really with intentionality and purpose in your leadership. As Robyn said, be curious and ask questions. Be flexible, be open, be inclusive, invite the community in, as Bruce highlighted. We all know change rarely happens in a straight line, but what beautiful opportunities lay in front of us.
Wonderful. It reminds me also of a quote that I use a lot, which is James Comer, which is, with every interaction in school, you're either building community or you're destroying it every time that you have an interaction. Bruce.
First of all, Sean, I just want to thank all of the educators who are online for the extraordinary work that they do each day. And I think that Robyn's invitation to us was to let's be bold and ambitious on behalf of our students, our learners, in all of their diversity, from all of their contexts, to really have very significant ambition for their lives, because they need to be equipped with the skills and the attributes to be able to learn, to unlearn, and to relearn across their life course. And what a wonderful opportunity we have. It's challenging, it's complex, but conversations like this take us into that heartland of the kind of core purpose. So keep that core purpose in mind as you're working into growing your leadership skill and capability.
Excellent. Yeah, and I would reiterate the call to the teachers. They've done a phenomenal job, and the principals and the superintendents over the last 18 months in changing on a dime, and really looking out for the students as well. Robyn?
So I would challenge everybody to take everything you've heard here today and think about your context. Is it a school? Is it a district? Is it an organization? Is it a podcast? And I want you to ask yourself a really important question, which is this. Based on everything I've heard, what is the one thing that if I were to address, reinvent, create in the next 90 days would have the biggest impact on my student success and my teacher success? And then rather than trying to do all the things or, integrate all the research at once, just think about that one thing that would have the greatest impact and then commit the next 90 days to removing a constraint or putting something in place that you've been ignoring or rearranging or rethinking something that you've been doing so that you can get better, you can have a better impact. So I want to get really practical here because we talk about these big ideas a lot of times and I'm like, yeah, go build, reconsider everything. But rather than doing that, I would love for you to just zone in on that one thing and then find that thing and go and start building something better and give yourself 90 days. Because when you look at that, if you look up in 90 days and you've done that, your school has made dramatic leaps forward and you've actually created something better.
And Rosie, we're gonna end with you.
Sure. I was just thinking, in a recent interview, I was talking to a newly appointed head of department, and their team had just told her on day one they didn't need a head of department at all. They were very happy just doing their old thing. And this head of department actually ended up Googling what is leadership. So let's hope that head of department wasn't in any of your schools. But what I would encourage you to do is make sure that you and your team do have a good sense of the breadth and depth of leadership and the different mindsets and capabilities that involves. One offer we're going to send out to people is just a free opportunity to anyone on the webinar to engage in what we call a personal leadership review. It's really simple, 20-30 minutes reflection piece online, looking at all these different aspects of leadership and your natural strengths, but also priorities for you to shift, like with Robyn, maybe something in the next 90 days to shift that you'd like to work on. So just as a practical where to get started, we'll send this out in the next few days to everybody. And my challenge to you is carve aside half an hour of me time to really reflect on your leadership and go from there to decide the next step forward for yourself.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. That, as always, has brought us a couple of minutes over the hour, but I want to thank everybody for being a guest on this, or for being a panelist, or for attending this webinar. And a little plug as well, we're actually launching a second mini webinar, which will be the third Tuesday of every month, which is going to focus on actions. So this one we're actually going to be running on the same topic that the conversations follows, but it's really getting one of our coaches in to talk about, here are some simple actions that can happen. The time probably won't work for our down under attendees, but as with this, everything gets recorded and can be viewed on our YouTube channel, and everybody will be notified by email. And with that, I will wrap up our webinar. And I just want to thank our wonderful speakers. I could have been here for another hour. Amy Newman, Bruce Armstrong, our own Rosie Connor, and of course, Robyn Jackson. It's been a wonderful discussion. And I will also say, Bruce, you were talking about how thankful you are to all the teachers. I'm actually thankful when I hear such intelligent conversation coming from people like we've had on this panel, and asking questions about the purpose of education, the purpose of getting people to thrive, not just survive, and actually that education plays more of a role than just content delivery. So I want to thank the 4 of you for engaging in this conversation as well, and the work that you all do. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Great conversation.
Thanks, everybody.